So this talk will be a little different. It's an idea that I've been milling around my brain for the past 6 months or so. So this is the first time I'm testing it out with an audience. You're going to help me crowdsource it. So my name's Anita Nikolich. I just finished up a tour at the National Science Foundation. I was a program officer for cybersecurity. NSF, National Science Foundation, funds most of the basic research in the US, and they fund almost 90% of computer science research. So security is underneath the kind of guise of computer science. Specifically, I was a program officer for networking security, social networking, and anti-censorship. So just to give you some background. And prior to that, my background's mostly in networking security. So I've been reading this book about amateur scientists, professional scientists, and how the twain sometimes meet, sometimes don't. I saw this cool quote from Arthur C. Clarke. He's the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I thought this was really interesting. I definitely encountered this a lot kind of in my time at NSF, because there's a lot of distinguished scientists that come back and forth through the halls. So I thought this was very interesting. So here's kind of the proposition. And I, as you'll see, I kind of ran this past a bunch of people, and the semantics change depending on what your preference is. But the proposition is the past 4 years that I've spent in the government at NSF, and prior to that I was at a university, prior to that I was just in IT operations, there is a lot of money that's spent doing academic security work. A lot of this work never gets any place. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It kind of lingers in papers, that's behind paywalls. At the same time, there's a lot of cool stuff I hear at these conferences that sometimes doesn't make it, the total feedback to whether it's improving security in a product or getting it out to people who could use it. That doesn't happen either. Sometimes it does, but the proposition is, how can we get kind of, I'll call them non-professional, us basically, non-professional researchers, operators, and official academic researchers to work together somehow. So some things to consider. Is this really even a distinction between these two? Is this becoming meaningless, particularly for security and privacy? Should it become meaningless, or are there roles for each? Should we have academics who, sometimes can't push the limits as much as we can, not being in academia? Or is research just research? Before about 1970, academics could use money very freely. You saw it from World War II to the 50s, 60s. They could use money very freely. They were given money. They could explore things. They didn't have to so much worry about publishing and tenure as they do now. Modern day, there's something called peer review. And if you're not familiar, kind of talk a little bit about it. But peer review means these ideas come to a panel. People like me, we invite distinguished experts to come and listen and be thoughtful about ranking these ideas. And peer review is kind of designed to prevent major shifts. Everything is very incremental in that when you bring up a novel idea or something really transformative, your fellow peers often say, well, that's not safe. That may not work. And science has become more like a business. So what prompted me to think about this? This isn't really anything new. I'll give you some examples of where it has been happening. So I remember back in high school, one of my teachers talking about and I don't have the correct name of it, but this great books program in New York City. Basically, it was kind of ordinary people talking with Columbia professors about, the great books. So they would bring people in, it's more common now, you see meetups, but this is back in the 60s or 70s. And the insight was, wow, all these kind of average people who read these classic works have really, insights that are pretty thoughtful. So that always kind of stuck with me. The past 4 years I've been at NSF, NSF spends, and this is just one agency, there are others, DARPA and others, NSF spends $80 million a year on basic privacy and security research. Many other agencies spend millions of it on applied work, on basic work. Why are there still so many security problems? One of the programs that I started there was this transition of practice program. I stole the name from Homeland Security, but basically what I wanted to do was, with all this money being spent, and this program that I was on was around for 10 years. So that's $800 million. And some of the same issues still are there year after year. So what can we do to transition some academic work get it into companies, get it in the hands of people who can use it? Many academics were very upset about this. They said, we want money to just do basic security work, and that's going to take away from it, getting it more practical. We can't do that. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and it evolved over the 4 years I was there to people kind of accepted that we're not taking away your right to do basic crypto work, but there's a lot of work that's sitting there that never gets into the hands of people who can use it. Another thing I noticed is I go to a lot of these conferences. I was lucky for my job. I got to go to a lot of these. If you look at the agendas, and I didn't have time to do this, but kind of in the past, I'd say 5 to 6 years, you look at the agendas for these kind of cons and academic conferences. They're very similar. The topics are very similar. The approaches are very similar, but neither kind of wants to be seen at each other's conferences. So when I'd say, I'm going to put in my travel request to go to DEF CON or any of the we call them principal investigators, are any of them going, the academics going? Many just will not go there. Can that be overcome? That people attend each other's events. Some talks that inspired me at ThoughtCon last year, maybe the year before, the cyber squirrel. Chris Thomas talked about the premise being squirrels are a bigger threat to the ICS systems than actual hackers. I thought that was really interesting, so I brought him into NSF, and we usually get like Nobel Prize winners and serious talks, and he gave this talk. And it's interesting, half the room walked out, and half the room just thought it was awesome. And I thought, there's something to that. This project is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but there's a lot of kind of quantitative metrics and approach to it that's very interesting. So that kind of struck a nerve with me that there's something to it. I'm sure many of you know, Jay Radcliffe, this hacker researcher, talked about the project a few years ago about hacking his own insulin pump and going to Johnson & Johnson and getting them to fix it. But he had a really nice talk last year, and that kind of really inspired me to crowdsource this about, can we inspire kind of this community to maybe use more of a scientific method to get some of our things that are not academic research to get traction with it? Maybe take things a little more seriously, maybe use a little more methodology, and do we want to? So at NSF, we were asked a lot, when an idea came by our desks or something, what does the community think? What does the community say about this? And me not being an academic, I kind of landed by circumstance at NSF. I'd say, well, who is the community? What do you mean by that? I mean, I came from security operations. When you say the community, who are you talking about? If it's the same people, writing the same papers for the same conferences, is that the community? Is it operators? So, what does that really mean? So this isn't a new problem. It got me to thinking, are there other disciplines, other areas besides security where this might have occurred? So I'm in one of these meetups for science books. So one of the books they had us read was about Mendel. And I'm not a biologist, not familiar with it, but it's a very interesting book. And I learned about Mendel, that this is, if you recall your high school biology, he's the father of Mendel's law of inheritance, which explains heredity and how traits are passed down. Well, he grew up on a farm. He worked as a gardener and a beekeeper, as a quiet guy. He ended up as a monk in this abbey in Brno. And what he did for his many years was grow pea plants. He literally just had pea plants in the garden, and he did these experiments, and he kept very meticulous notes. He wanted to develop new color variants and examine hybridization, and this had never been done before. So he did this for many, many years and published a paper, which he sent to these proceedings. He sent them to the Royal Society, the Linnaean Society, the Smithsonian, and they just, because he wasn't a professional scientist, the paper wasn't taken seriously. It was kind of put into this very obscure journal and forgotten about. Well, when this Dutch botanist, a friend of his who was cleaning out his stuff prior to moving, sent him this paper, and he said, "This is amazing." So it took many years. Now, it wasn't until 1909 where all these things were finally pinned to the discoveries Mendel first described in that paper, which just by happenstance, this paper happened to be found. So that got me thinking, it seems like there's a similar thing going on in our community. Another example, which I love, because I live in Chicago, this is Sue, the T-Rex Sue at the Field Museum. It's the biggest, best preserved, if you've never seen it, it's this amazing looking T-Rex. Well, Sue Hendricks, it was named after her, she found it. And she was a high school dropout. She moved to Florida to go diving. She lived with her uncle, and she was an explorer, adventurer. She caught these fish to sell to aquariums. Rare ones she would just sell at cost to museums. And she hooked up with some explorers and said, "I'll help you dig up fossils." And she ended up, their tire was flat, so they had to spend the night there. And she said, there's this ridge we haven't explored yet. And it was kind of on her instinct of doing this for many years that she actually, not the paleontologist, not the geologist, an untrained explorer, had the tenacity, and she found this fossil. So there's another example. I think astronomy is another great example. Although in astronomy, typically we have the tools at our disposal in computer science and security versus like astronomy. But there's a couple interesting examples. I never knew about this, the Shoemaker-Levy comet, which of course many of us have heard about. I didn't realize that Carol Shoemaker, who is one of the discoverers of it, at one point she had found the greatest number of these asteroids and comets of any person. I think that's been superseded, but she was not formally trained. She was a housewife. She didn't start her observations until she was 51 years old. She just kind of was a fan. Her husband was an astronomer. She had no training in this at all, but she kind of made a really big difference in this field. So I thought this was interesting. And sorry, my slides are a little all over the place. But I put together side by side, I just randomly grabbed a few years ago, just randomly some talks from DEF CON and some from Usenix Security. Usenix Security is a big, kind of big event people like to publish in. So I kind of put them next to each other. And I wonder if people can really tell which is which. Maybe some of you have been, but if you take a look at it, kind of look at the topics. I don't know if anybody has a guess or if you maybe know this already. So the one on the left is Usenix. The one on the right is DEF CON. And if you kind of look at the titles and the topics, you could almost switch the two around and you could be at one of the other conference. So some things we're not talking about, citizen science. There's this really good article, which I know is a little hard to read on the bottom, but I could send you the link. Really good article on citizen science. Citizen science is where kind of scientists set up experiments and people help contribute to it. And mostly the scientists get the benefits. They're the ones that get kind of the fame, that kind of the same with SETI. That's where you donate your kind of compute power to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Bug bounties, I think that's a whole topic in and of itself that has kind of an ecosystem set up already. Same as these, I'll call them professional hackers, such as this HackerOne, which helps facilitate the bug bounty programs. I'm also not really talking about kind of, research being done on your own accord. What I really would like to get to is how can these communities share better across the boundaries. So a lot of people call this valley of death, from a really cool idea to making something happen or getting into a product. This is kind of gap between research, whether it's academia or elsewhere, and how is it translated into either better products, marketable products, something that can be useful. This isn't new. There's a lot of these incubators. There's these industry university collaborations to generate commercial products. But a lot of companies are eliminating or seriously scaling back their research arm. I mean, companies like, Microsoft and RSA and Dell and these kind of places, they're scaling back, and what they're doing is just giving $50,000 grants to academics and saying, we don't want to keep people full-time on staff. So kind of discovery, which many times was done by the Bell Labs and these big companies, that's not the case so much anymore. So I ran some of these ideas just past 4 different groups: academics, industry, I'll say underground, kind of, hacker community, and government. In my informal crowdsourcing, about 70% of people were kind of excited, like, yeah, that's a good idea. And about 30%, mostly academics, were like, no way, it would ruin my credibility. I don't see it that I would get anything out of it. But I did have quite a number of people who thought, and I'll go into some examples where it's been done in the past, that, as long as you can ensure there's no damage done, and as long as you can ensure this is done in a pretty ethical way, that it's a cheap way to get good research, and it's a good way to get people involved in something official. So if you're, many of us have day jobs, but we do kind of interesting researchy stuff on the side, it's a great way if you want to get promoted or get something, on your CV. It's a great way if you just have altruistic motives, you really want to make a difference. And it's a great way if you just want, $5,000 to get some stuff to tinker around with and help somebody. I mean, I think there's a lot of different needs that can be satisfied. So just a short kind of, if you don't know how academic security and privacy studies are funded, it's just, it's something I learned a lot about going to NSF. But before, as I mentioned before, about 1970, funding was just, you went to your university, you're a professor there, you got money. One example in the UK is it's called the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851. It's a granting agency. They used to allow awardees to just pursue research. They give money and say, pursue whatever research you want, wherever it goes, that's fine. It comes up, you'll come up with something useful. Now you need to have a proposal be judged. It's the same way at NSF. You come in, and that's kind of the machine of proposal writing. You come in with an idea, you get a committee of people, they evaluate it, they give you the money. And private foundations also give a lot of grants. MacArthur, Gates give a lot of grants. And they have very little obligations on the part of academic researchers. It's almost like a gift, as long as you can get the money. But the metrics of success, by and large, are papers. I'm going to skip this just because it's late in the day. So some obstacles, and I'm sure there are many. These are some obstacles I have found to engaging kind of the academic side. A lot of the workshops, academic workshops, are invite only. You don't hear about them. Right before I left, I sponsored a really cool one, which is great. It was great timing on trustworthy algorithms, fake news. And it was fascinating, but very explicitly, my boss, kind of the government folks, wanted just academics. And of course, if you do that, you're not going to get necessarily interesting opinions and ideas. Failure is considered bad. You think in science that failure is encouraged in experimentation. Failure is considered bad because then you don't have a paper that says you did something interesting. Whereas if it's really, really incremental, we call it just a hack of something, that's praised because it's gone well. Conferences, if you haven't been to an academic conference, it's mostly people reading papers that were already put online. There's not a lot of socializing except for maybe finding a collaborator you by and large knew at grad school or some other conference. The incentive in that world, and I think we have to be very mindful, what's the incentive? It's tenure if you're an academic, which requires papers at top conferences, publishing often. At many, MIT, Stanfords nowadays in the past about 5 years, they want you to show that you have some form of startup or entrepreneurial experience. And of course, getting grants from funding agencies. It's all about how much money you can get in there. So the driving factor, if you look at this in the negative way, is not necessarily making security and privacy better in a tangible way. We can look at that and say, well, that is what they're doing. But in a very tangible way, the goal is to get tenure, and that's by doing these things. Some obstacles to engaging, I'll call non-academic researchers. Cons like this are culturally a little hard to navigate if you don't know people, or you're introverted, or maybe you don't have something to do at the village. So I think for a lot of people, they're culturally hard to kind of get into. A lot of people don't attend these events, so their ideas or their work is a little hard to track down. And people who attend, many of them don't give speeches. They don't, broadcast their ideas. Of course, we know not all motives are altruistic. A lot of the work, however, I think is done by many people for personal satisfaction, for the challenge. It's not necessarily, you don't really necessarily want, car companies to fix things, but for your own challenge to show that you had an idea and it came to fruition. And I think a lot of people lack the interest and time in collaborating with any kind of official entity. I won't read all of this, but so one thing here is, well, can I just read the research and get inspired? And it's interesting. I've noticed the past 4 to 5 years, and I've heard it already today, and I've only been here since mid-afternoon, is a lot of people do read academic papers or, want to be able to get to the original source. So academic conferences might publish the full papers online. Workshops occasionally have the white papers online. I find those two things I find them easier to digest oftentimes because they're shorter. Since 2013, publicly funded grants or agencies with that grant over $100 million in R&D, research and development, have to make the data publicly accessible to search, retrieve, and analyze. They're still figuring out how, but it's via this memo. Journals, however, are always behind a paywall, almost always. It's a big problem with a lot of debate. There's one publishing company that you have to pay them to publish, you have to pay them to read it. So there's a workaround called Sci-Hub, which has 64 million articles up there, and they claim to have 85% of the paywalled scholarly articles up there for you to read. So a lot of people do that as a workaround through the paywall. And I just found this really interesting quote. that people have, time to become experts on quackery and pop science. Wouldn't it be nice to start seeing them take up actual science as a hobby and be able to read these papers? There was a really cool paper in the Atlantic, or article in the Atlantic a few weeks ago along this line, saying the more kind of sophisticated science becomes, the harder it is to communicate results. So if you try to read some of these onerous papers, the concept's often very simple. The communication of it can tend to be very onerous. So it's a fascinating article. It's kind of a long read, but very interesting. I just noted, if you're not familiar with these folks, I wasn't, but there's some really interesting work that's been produced by, I just plucked out a handful of people with some cool projects that I think would be kind of interesting takers on this idea. Yoshi Kono, who's University of Washington, he had this article on the top about encoding malware into a strand of DNA. Damon McCoy does all this cool stuff on looking at the Silk Road and the dark web and analyzing Craigslist rental scams and Nigerian gangs and things like that. Reshipping a mule scams, it's how to use your Visa card to do reshipping scams. Stefan Savage has this awesome project on measuring cybercrime and actually how much money's made off the dark web and cybercrime. People talk about this, but he's actually measuring how much money's made there. He also did this remote car hacking in 2010. So what if we brought the two sides together? One of the, we see this time gap kind of between academic stuff and stuff you see at these cons. So, if you went to DEF CON last year, this voting village had tons of press attention, saying it was the first ever look at voting security, and they had all these voting machines. It's the first time people have hacked into them, but people have actually been doing this work for years. It's just not published. It's not publicized very well. There are tons of kind of obscure journal stuff and different workshops on how people have hacked voting machines. But again, were we to get that out sooner, were we to kind of married up with people who could make a splash in the press, perhaps that can make a difference. This has nothing to do with security, but I thought this was a super cool project. This guy came to talk to us. He's a computer scientist at Brandeis. It's a project called Digital Amati. And he is a computer scientist, a mathematician, and for whatever reason, even though he doesn't play an instrument, wanted to create the perfect cello. So he spent 5 years tracking down these artists and people who make cellos. They're more into the art of it, not so much the kind of equations of it. Well, he's really into the computational thinking. So he thought, what if he could bring together his computational thinking and Euclidean geometry and the art of this cello and kind of the science of instrument design. So he created this thing called a geometry engine, and he wanted to design the perfect cello to sound like these, ones that were made in the 18th century. And it took him years before people even, this famous one, he wanted to do a CT scan to see, what does it really look like? And it took him 3 or 4 years. He had to fly to Italy in his vacation time and convince them that he was worthy of what they said, you don't even play the cello. Why do you want to do this? But it was his fascination with kind of the perfect shapes and angles. And as it turns out, they have a wonderful collaboration now of kind of arts and music and in computation. So I thought that was just kind of an inspiring example. Some prior efforts at DARPA, when Mudge was there at DARPA, there was this cyber fast track where they gave microgrants to just kind of average people. He noticed that, the cyber incidents kept increasing from, kind of the 5 years prior to him going to DARPA. But also spending on security was increasing by the federal government. So what can we do? So one of his answers was, kind of give out these microgrants as an alternative to traditional funding. And they averaged a week from proposal to giving the funds. One of the projects that came out of it was the car hacking research that was presented in 2015. Other efforts, I just wanted to put these kind of down. There's things like experience tracks at academic conferences where you're not an academic, but you have experience as an operator. Case studies to show, for human-computer interaction, and in AI conferences. So there's kind of other thinking, but nothing really formal. Some more efforts, bug bounties. I'm the Cavalry is kind of a nascent, or I guess not so nascent effort on promoting public safety research. There's a lot of public-private threat sharing, the ISACs and kind of different places who share threat indicators. And I thought this was cool, this workshop in London, where they were trying to get together academics and kind of business people. And they had some ideas, a number where you could kind of pair up a business person to bounce ideas off of and an academic. Hackathons extended beyond just kind of the coding phase, but, how can you, have an opportunity to learn and pitch and talk to each other. So things like that to kind of make it more sustainable than just a hackathon weekend. So what can we do with the current model? Some adventurous faculty have said, they'd be happy to sponsor kind of non-academics to participate, to give them micro grants, encouraging particularly undergrads who don't have a lot of these boundaries in the way they think. A lot of the government agencies could easily kind of include this underground component, and I think inviting non-academics to workshops. So in this kind of underground area, what can be done? Some of these crazy academics who are interested in, who have been pushing the boundaries, explicitly involve them. They cannot do offensive research with these grants. They're banned from doing that. So this is an opportunity. Many of them that I spoke to said this is a great way for us to not do it, but give you a micro grant and you can try it and tell us what happened. So it's, from their thinking, this is like a win-win for them. Maybe there's some matchmaking that can be made at these different cons. It's interesting, many academic, like more than a handful who I've run across who are, and some of them are crypto experts, say, not only do they not use PGP, they can't figure out many of the open source tools that many of us use. Simple things like LastPass and other kind of tools, because they're not used to the practical hands-on experience. So can we, school them on just the practical design of usability for some of these tools? So I think part of the challenge of how we as kind of non-professional, community is how do we broadcast what we know and find out? Many in this world are kind of these media savvy people. Some are not. They don't want to be broadcasting things. Is there a kind of middle ground to help broadcast some of the results? Are there things that haven't been tried? A journal. Journals, the challenge is who would peer review? It takes a lot of time. Who'd put the time into organizing it, getting reviews? It's a great place to show off your work. It takes a lot of work to write, to read, to peer review. Maybe a virtual journal. Maybe for some of these CTFs, bringing academics and hackers together as equals. Setting up, participating, doing the actual grunt work is something, that where you learn a whole lot. Maybe there's a new joint neutral venue or conference, physical meetings, virtual meetings, kind of bring people together. Does a model work elsewhere? I just want to bring this up. So I was involved in the bodybuilding world, and it's very prevalent in sports performance, at least bodybuilding. I put up there kind of the picture of Mr. Olympia contenders and supplements. And you think of it, they're called gurus, which makes you think of kind of the traditional guru. The gurus are like these guys with the green check. They're like guys who are really good at figuring out supplements, training, timing, all this stuff. So to me, that was a very interesting, kind of convergence of you have people trained in this stuff, and they're not necessarily the ones that athletes are using. I think the biohacking type stuff, quantified self, this guy, Larry Smar, he's an academic, computer science professor, does a lot of this quantified self stuff, but he's got the tools at hand. He's got a lot of expensive tools to be able to measure different things about his body. And you have people who go to meetups, and they're doing a lot of the same kind of thing, just kind of on a different level. Could we get a feedback loop between the two? So that's my idea. Thank you for sticking with me to listen through it. If you have some comments or thoughts or think it's stupid or great or want to make something happen, let me know.